In the spring of 1865, the United States stood at a perilous crossroads. The Civil War was drawing to a bloody close after 4 harrowing years. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost. Cities lay in ruins. The Confederate capital at Richmond had fallen, and on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. For President Abraham Lincoln, the long-awaited dawn of peace had finally broken. But that fragile peace would be shattered just 5 days later. On the night of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. There, in one of the most infamous acts in American history, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the president's box and fired a single fatal shot. John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old when he assassinated Lincoln. Born in Maryland to a prominent family of actors, he had been a rising star on stage before the war. But his passions extended far beyond theater. A fierce supporter of the Confederacy and its cause, Booth opposed the abolition of slavery and despised Lincoln's leadership. Initially, Booth had plotted merely to kidnap the president and leverage him for the release of Confederate prisoners. But as the South collapsed and the war ended, his plan evolved into murder. The act, he believed, would plunge the Union into chaos and reignite the Confederate cause. After firing the shot, Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, reportedly shouting Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Despite breaking his leg in the fall, he escaped the theater and launched a desperate 12-day flight through the Maryland and Virginia countryside, aided by Confederate sympathizers. Booth was finally cornered on April 26, 1865, at a tobacco barn on Garrett's Farm in Virginia. Refusing to surrender, he was shot by Union soldiers. When he died, they searched his body and found several personal items, including a small, red leather-covered date book, roughly the size of a hand. It would become the centerpiece of one of the most enduring mysteries of the Civil War. Though often called a diary, the object was actually a memorandum book, published by a Washington stationer. Inside were scattered entries in Booth's careful handwriting. He had written most of them during his days on the run following Lincoln's death. Yet when the diary was later turned over to the War Department, something peculiar was noted. 12 pages had been cut out, neatly, deliberately, removed with a blade. The discovery of the missing pages quickly became a source of intrigue. The logical question arose: who had removed them, and what did they contain? Some historians believed Booth had removed the pages himself, perhaps to erase earlier incriminating details or to dispose of irrelevant notes. Others pointed to a more unsettling possibility, that someone in the government had excised the pages to suppress information Booth had written in the final days of his life. Theories abounded. One conjecture held that Booth had named co-conspirators in the plot to assassinate Lincoln, individuals too politically sensitive to implicate. Another theory suggested the pages referenced Southern sympathizers in the North, or even hinted at involvement beyond Booth's immediate circle. It is important to note that 8 men and women were tried and convicted for conspiring with Booth, and 4 were hanged, but historians still debate whether the full extent of the conspiracy was ever really uncovered. The missing pages only added fuel to that uncertainty. For years, Booth's diary remained under government control, mostly out of public view. It was produced as evidence during the 1867 impeachment trial of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, though not for the reason one might expect. Stanton, a prominent figure in Lincoln's cabinet, had been accused by President Andrew Johnson's allies of overstepping his authority. During the trial, Booth's diary was introduced in an attempt to show that Stanton had mishandled or tampered with crucial evidence. At that point, the missing pages became a political weapon, with one faction accusing Stanton or others in the War Department of removing them to conceal damning information, but no definitive proof ever emerged. More than a century later, in 1977, the FBI's forensic lab examined the diary under ultraviolet light. The analysis revealed that the missing pages had likely been removed before the diary came into the government's custody. There was no evidence that the writing on the missing sheets had bled through to the next page, a frustrating dead end for investigators. Still, questions remained. Why were certain pages missing while others, some of which included deeply personal reflections by Booth, were left intact. Would Booth have destroyed the pages during his flight when he had only minutes to write? Or had someone else, perhaps closer to the halls of power, done so with purpose? Today the diary resides in Ford's Theater National Historic Site collection. Its pages are yellowed, its leather worn with age. Visitors can view it through the glass, close enough to see Booth's precise penmanship, but forever separated from the missing chapters of his story. Over time, the diary has become more than just an artifact. It symbolizes the uncertainty of history, the frustrating gaps, the unsolved riddles, the lingering suspicion that some truths remain hidden, not by accident, but by design. And in that sense, it serves as a metaphor for the Civil War itself, a conflict defined by unresolved tensions, competing narratives, and wounds that, in many ways, remain open. There's no certainty in the tale of the missing pages, only questions, only possibilities, and that's what makes it compelling. For every myth that surrounds the Lincoln assassination, every new theory that surfaces, Booth's diary stands as a reminder. Even when the main event seems settled, the margins of history hold their own quiet enigmas, little known, rarely discussed, yet stubbornly persistent in their refusal to be explained away.